The gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Nunn, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for the panel being here. You are all experts on China, the threat emerging from China. As we look at things as a counterintelligence officer myself, who protects our national security, as somebody who's flown recon operations in international airspace, not violating other countries' sovereign airspace territory has been seen in recent days. We have a real concern here, and I think one of the greatest threats to U.S. national security in relationship to China right now is not on the battlefield, but it's in that area where a great transfer of U.S. wealth is going to build the Chinese economy, whether that's state-owned businesses, whether that is their foreign investment in infrastructure done with American credit, or whether that is the actual buildup of the People's Liberation Army. With this, Mr. Williams, you've highlighted, firsthand how export controls, restrictions and subsidies received by China on the global stage are becoming a threat. One of the things I'd like to learn, first of all, before we get to a situation of a kinetic conflict between the United States and China, how can we provide an off-ramp for China to do right by the United States and themselves, as well as U.S. companies really leading in this space, to have good behavior that's going to reward America and not allow China to continue to take advantage of us?
So I think what I would start with is the need to bifurcate the kinds of activity that we have with China. On one hand, there are things that can clearly contribute to their military development, that can raise national security threats, and we need to crack down on that kind of behavior. On the other hand, we want to maintain linkages with China where we can. Right. And I think there's been a lot of conversation today about distinguishing between the PRC and the Chinese people. And it's important to maintain that distinction, and it's important for us to have our companies engaging directly with the Chinese people themselves. And I think from someone from Iowa, having more exports into China is good. It helps Iowa farmers. I also think looking at our financial services industry, they need to be on the ground in China to do business in China and to be globally competitive. So let's maintain those links while cracking down on the ones that are problematic.
Mr. Williams, I think you've hit the point head on. One of the bills that I'm looking at introducing here is neutralizing the Unfair Chinese Subsidy Act of 2023. What this really looks to do is to identify the way in which the Treasury Secretary could develop a strategic plan today and a timeline to work with our allies in order to seek China's compliance with international export subsidy standards. This goes to both a multilateral, which you've spoken to, approach with our allies, as well as a very targeted bilateral pressure towards China. So the follow-up question here, what levers would you recommend the administration utilize, maybe those levers that are not being utilized, and how could we move forward with this in a pragmatic way?
So I like where your legislation is going, and I will say I think it's part of a broader approach. And so on one hand, we do want to engage with the OECD and enforce these rules against China, and I think we should talk about how to do that, how to work with allies and partners to put that pressure on China. At the same time, we don't want to race to the bottom with China, but we do have an export credit agency, XM Bank, that can provide an alternative to what China is doing. And I've had a couple recommendations earlier today on how to loosen some of the strings around XM so it can provide a meaningful alternative. Things like having their China Transformational Exports program that cuts through red tape, things like allowing them to take a little bit greater risk to make sure that we're actually in the same level playing field as China.
Excellent. Mr. Williams, I would echo here with the chair, this can be truly a bipartisan effort, that we need to have a strategy towards China today, not a strategy that develops after an incident occurs and that we are in a reactive posture. We have the opportunity to lay out a clear roadmap here on how the U.S., China, and our allies can mutually be successful rather than locked in this long-term strategy of adversarial relationship that regretfully could end up in a kinetic situation. So with that, I would reach across the aisle to my colleagues to support what could be a bipartisan lever here on holding China accountable for their Subsidies Act. And again, I want to thank the committee for hearing from this incredible group of witnesses and your expertise in the area. With that, Mr. Chair, I yield back my time.